This is Jonathan Caldwell, and my topic for my senior seminar paper for Dr. Vandercook was looking at two different types of salvation and seeing the biblical basis for both of them. I looked at free will salvation against reformed view of salvation, which is based upon predestination. And throughout my paper, I looked at different scriptures that both interpreted and seeing which one has a greater case across all of Scripture. And the reason I chose this topic was because I know that this theological debate of free will salvation against predestination exists in the church today. And I believed that having a good understanding of both sides will allow me to better interpret Scripture, but also better vocalize to others and be able to help them through this debate as well, allowing them to see both sides. And so I thought it was interesting, and it was a topic that interested me as well because I've had debates with my friends on this issue as well. And so just being able to see both sides of the arguments was really interesting. But the reason I chose this side of the topic for free will salvation was because I do believe that there is a greater case found in Scripture to support free will salvation. That is why my thesis statement in my paper is surrounded around free will salvation, because my thesis is, although many people have biblical arguments for the Reformed view of predestination, a stronger case is represented in Scripture to show salvation is based upon free will. And there were many major concepts that I needed to study, but two of the major ones that I looked at was I did look at the history of the views to see how they have translated throughout all of church history. And both of these views do have a deep history, a long history. And so another major concept that I needed to look at was obviously Scripture. And I looked at certain verses and how Reformed view of salvation looked at it and interpreted those verses. And then I did the same thing for free will salvation and how they interpreted those same verses throughout Scripture. And key scholars in the debate of free will salvation and the Reformed view of salvation. For Reformed view, early church leaders such as John Calvin and Ulrich Zwingli or Martin Bucer, they believed in predestination. They believed in the Reformed view of salvation. And modern day scholars such as John MacArthur looked at predestination and believe in predestination. And so Calvin and MacArthur are two of the main scholars that I look at throughout my paper and how they interpret the scriptures that do support predestination or do support free will salvation. But the free will scholars, the early ones, are Jacob Arminius or Charles Finney. And there were many different scholars I looked at for free will salvation, but just a couple are Walter Liefeld and Rodney Whitaker. And throughout my paper, I do believe that there were strengths just as there were weaknesses. Some of my strengths that I saw throughout my paper was that I did support my quotes very well. So if I introduced a quote from an author, I was able to support it and show the reader this is what this quote shows. This is what this quote is trying to show the reader. I also believe that I used a great variety of sources. I used websites, I used periodicals, I used books, commentaries. I used a wide variety of sources. And so I do believe that's a strength in my paper. And I didn't focus too much on just one author. I tried to look at different authors in the debates, but I do believe that my paper flowed well from start to finish, and that the reader will be able to understand what I'm trying to get across through my paper, and that they'll understand where I'm going. But as there are strengths in papers, I believe I had weaknesses as well. One of my weaknesses that I struggled with was I don't believe I had enough scripture, or not enough scripture, but not enough support for free will salvation. I looked at verses that the Reformed view looked at, but I wasn't able to look at verses that free will salvation really looked at. I was only able to look at how they interpreted the same verses from the Reformed view. But I also believe that there may have been some repetitive words that I used, especially when introducing quotes. I tried to use a wide variety, but it is difficult for me to find words when introducing quotes like Paul states or Paul wrote, things such as that. I believe I repeated maybe a little too much. And formatting issues, I struggled with Turabian. And so I do believe that there were some formatting issues, and hopefully I'll be able to get better in that area with the formatting issues. But some of the information that really stuck out to me was just how much of a rich history that both views have. I never realized how far back these views started. And so I was pretty impressed to see how deep of a history and how it has translated throughout all of church history, from the start until today. Another thing that I saw was that there is a biblical basis for both views. I saw that there are scriptures that do support predestination, but there are scriptures that support free will salvation as well. And if I had a chance to rewrite my paper, I think one thing I definitely would do is spend a little less time looking at the history. I do believe understanding the history is important for the reader, but I believe if I took back on the history a little bit, it would have offered me more of an opportunity to look at those scriptures that free will salvation believes in, and that I could have looked at the scripture free will looks at and then seen how the Reformed view interprets those same verses. And so I do believe that my paper was written very strongly, but there are a couple disclaimers I want to say for my paper. I know when introducing my topic to the class, we talked about other views of salvation that exist, such as Molinism. And I did not look at Molinism in my paper because I knew it would have taken up too much room in my paper. I wanted to focus on the two views of free will salvation and the Reformed view of salvation. And hitting on that issue of Reformed view of salvation throughout my paper, I refer to the Reformed view of salvation, but sometimes I call it the Reformed view of predestination. And I just want y'all to know that those are the same things. The Reformed view of salvation is based upon predestination. So if I say Reformed view of salvation, I'm meaning the Reformed view of predestination, and vice versa. If I say the Reformed view of predestination, I'm meaning the Reformed view of salvation as well. And the last thing that I wanted to point out as a disclaimer for my paper is that the scholars for free will salvation, they all had basically the same thoughts and how they were interpreting the verses. So I may not have so many for free will salvation and how they interpret the verses because they all interpret it in the same way, and I didn't want to add information into my paper just to add information. But this is my paper, and I hope y'all enjoy it. Thank you.